Hi, I'm Charles Gross. A few years ago, the New York Times published a major mea culpa saying that they had got a lot of things wrong, but in the future they would try to do better. They would try to be the newspaper that everybody expects it to be. And since then, they've done a lot of chest thumping and a lot of promotion saying, oh, we are the only thing that stands in the way of government totalitarianism. We are the free press. We are everything. We are so important. And in theory, they are right. Freedom of press is so important, which is all the more reason that I am here to express my disappointment of this very lengthy article published in this week's New York Times Magazine. New York Times has a very well documented and very long history of bias against Israel, but here they reach a new high. I have never, I don't think, seen a greater case of an article with half-truths, outright lies, fake news, and, yellow journalism, as I have here. It's a disgrace. The writer is Nathan Thrall. Who was the editor for this? Walter Burns, the unscrupulous editor from the play Front Page? It appears so. There is so much in here that they get wrong, and more importantly, so much that is left out so that things in Israel appear to be wrong. Now, I'm sure I'm going to leave a lot of stuff out because this is a long article, but I'm going to try and address the points here. First of all, the article says that Israel is the greatest recipient of military aid. Well, that's the first outright lie. Now, it is true we do give Israel military aid. We give them billions of dollars of military aid. Where does it go? It goes to Israel? Well, I don't know if it actually ever gets to Israel because all of that aid is spent here in the United States. Money for United States businesses, jobs for U.S. workers. But it could still be the largest recipient, Israel could be, but no, it's not. Because we have 56,000 troops in Korea. And I assure you, those 56,000 troops cost a lot more than we are spending on Israel every year, which again is spending the money right here. And what about the military bases we have in Europe? Now, we don't have any military bases in Israel. We're just sending them money to protect themselves. And again, he would have you imply, Mr. Burns and Mr. Thrall, would have you imply that this is money being used against Palestinians. And true, there are times when it is used in defense against Palestinians, like when Hamas is firing 10,000 rockets from Gaza into Israeli playgrounds. Yes, they do. But what else is it being used for? To prevent aggression from Syria, from Iran, from Lebanon, from Hamas, and from Hezbollah. Remember, it is not just the Palestinians that would like to see Israel wiped off the map. There are plenty of Arab nations, in fact, quite the majority of Arab nations would like that. Somehow, when mentioning military aid, well, Mr. Thrall doesn't seem that that is important enough to mention. Or to include, I should say. Now, the theme of this article is BDS, Boycott, Diversion, Sanctions, a group that wants to end Israel, very simply. What they want to do now, essentially, it's interesting. I don't think Mr. Thrall realizes that he is admitting that. BDS basically says, yes, they'll be very happy to have a Palestinian state, but what they want to do is of a right of return flood Israel with Arabs, with Palestinians, so that Jews will no longer be a majority in Israel, and Israel will cease to be a Jewish state, or it will have to become an apartheid state. We'll get to apartheid very shortly. Thrall's article basically admits this time and time again, except that Thrall doesn't seem to realize it, that BDS essentially wants the elimination of Israel as a Jewish state. Now, why should there be a Jewish state? Well, we have Christian states. Have you ever heard of England? England is a Christian state. President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority says if there is ever a Palestinian state, it will be an Islamic state. We have many, many Muslim/Islamic states. We have one Jewish state, but that apparently is one too many for BDS and the Arabs. And that is the problem, but Mr. Thrall, although he sort of acknowledges it inadvertently, doesn't realize it, that, well, there does need to be a Jewish state. Why does there need to be a Jewish state? Well, for one thing, to prevent another Holocaust. During the Holocaust, Hitler allowed the Jews to leave. Problem was they had nowhere to go, not even to the United States. So if that ever happens again, Jews have a place to go, and they have gone there. Now, then Mr. Thrall and Mr. Burns cite the history. Well, they leave quite a bit of it out, of course. They do mention that the Palestinians have had many chances to form a state, but they didn't. What they don't mention is that between 1948 and 1967, all the land that the Arabs claim they want for a Palestinian state was in Arab hands. West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, so they could have formed a Palestinian state any time they wanted to between 1948 and 1967, but instead they decided that they would rather destroy the Jewish state. Now, one thing he quotes is that BDS would like to send Palestinians back into Israel because of General Assembly Resolution 194. What he leaves out is that 194 says they have to come and live in peace. And the Arabs do not want to live in peace with Israel. Now, according to Mr. Thrall and I guess Mr. Burns, the history of Israel goes back prior to 1967, at least according to BDS. BDS claims it goes back 100 years ago to the 19th century when Zionism began, when Jews began returning to Israel. And they say that's the problem. So again, this article admits inadvertently that it is BDS's goal to get rid of a Jewish state, to wipe Israel off the map, to have Israel as an existing territory, but not as a Jewish state. But let's see again. Now here is where what is left out of this article is significant. Number one, there have always been Jews living in Israel. For 38 centuries, 3,800 years and going on. Now, also, the other thing you must remember is that there was never a state called Palestine. A territory called Palestine, so named so that people would forget about Israel, but never a state, never a Palestinian people until, till after Israel was formed, in fact. It was all Arabs. And Israel was part of the Ottoman Empire prior to World War I. But before it was part of the Ottoman Empire, it was part of the Roman Empire. And prior to that, part of the Greek Empire. And, well, prior to that, part of the Babylonian Empire. And prior to that, cover your ears, BDS, it was the land of Israel. The biblical, historical, archaeological evidence is overwhelming that you have to be either you have to be either a Palestinian president or perhaps Mr. Thrall or Mr. Burns to deny it. And now he doesn't deny it per se, but he doesn't include it. He doesn't include that land that Jews settled in was purchased. He doesn't point out that this was not Palestinian land, that it in fact was under the Ottoman Empire, and then it was British, and then under a mandate by the League of Nations, which, by the way, is binding on the United Nations, that there be a state of Israel, that there be a Jewish state, which in fact encompasses a lot more than the actual state of Israel is now. Now, going back to the War of 1948, a war initiated by Arab countries against Israel. So in other words, Arabs trying to wipe out the Jewish state. Mr. Thrall notes that many Palestinians fled or were forced to flee. Now, why did the ones who weren't forced to flee leave? They could have stayed. In fact, often they were encouraged to do so. Well, they were told by their Arab brothers, you see all these Jews who've got all this land that they've purchased since the 1900s, since the 1800s? Well, come with us. We'll get rid of the Jews. All their property will be yours. Well, as we know, it didn't work out that way. And many of these Arabs were not allowed to return. But according to Mr. Thrall and Mr. Burns, all the Jews were. Well, that's not quite true either. In fact, that's not at all true. Many Jews were not allowed to return. Oh, not to Israel. But there were Jews who had lived in Egypt, in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Iraq, in Morocco for 2,000 years. Remember, I said that there was a land of Israel, and there was. But when the Jews were forced to leave, or most of them were forced to leave, many of them settled in Europe, but many of them also settled in Arab lands. And they stayed there for 2,000 years. And in fact, 850,000 of them were forced to leave their homes of 2,000 years after the State of Israel was formed. Now, you don't hear too much about them because, well, they settled in Israel, where they make up almost half of the population. So these Jewish Palestinians were given a place in Israel. But were the Arab Palestinians given a place in these lands? I mean, they had all that land because they had thrown out the Jews. No, they were forced to remain refugees. Now, they are still considered refugees today, which is ironic because no one else gets to be a refugee after a generation. You were considered a citizen of the land that you are a refugee of, except that Palestinians in Arab lands other than Jordan are not allowed green cards, are not allowed citizenship, they're not allowed to go to schools, they're not allowed to become doctors. They are kept in refugee camps. Now, I don't see anything about that in this 12-page article. I mean, if we care about Palestinian rights, if BDS cares about Palestinian rights, shouldn't they care that Palestinians get citizenship instead of being refugees? I mean, they could still emigrate to a future Palestinian state, but why can't they be citizens, or why can't they at least get green cards? Nothing here. Nothing about 850,000 Jewish refugees, not from Europe, from Arab lands, settling in what is ultimately 0.01% of the land in the Middle East. The Arabs have 99.9% of the land in the Middle East. Israel has 0.01%, and even that is too much for BDS. But the New York Times doesn't seem to want to mention that here. Sad, but unfortunately not unexpected. But the fact that he mentions it proves that Israel is not an apartheid state.
This is a map of the Middle East. Here's Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Syria. Now, you see that little yellow speck? That's Israel. Kind of makes you wonder what all the fuss is about.